20 January 1961, while America sat mesmerized before their television sets, watching John F. Kennedy raise his hand to take the presidential oath, Marilyn Monroe was crossing a very different kind of threshold. Not into power, but away from it. Not toward the cameras, but desperately away from them. As 50 million Americans witnessed history being made in Washington, D.C., Hollywood's most photographed woman slipped across the Mexican border into Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated. While every newspaper in America prepared Kennedy inauguration headlines, Marilyn's lawyers had orchestrated what they hoped would be the quietest divorce in Hollywood history. But here's what those lawyers didn't understand about Marilyn Monroe. In 1961, there was no such thing as her doing anything quietly. Even her escapes became legend. Even her attempts to disappear made her more visible. And this 4-day journey to a dusty border courthouse would become one of the most whispered-about chapters in her final 18 months of life. Because what happened in Juarez wasn't just a divorce. It was the moment Marilyn tried to erase one life before the next one consumed her completely. Before we cross that border with Marilyn, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of Hollywood's golden age, the moments that happened away from the cameras, the decisions that changed everything, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version. It's the real story of 4 days that Hollywood tried to bury. To understand why Marilyn Monroe found herself in a Mexican border town on Inauguration Day 1961, you have to go back 5 years. Back to June 29, 1956, back to the moment when Norma Jean Baker truly believed she had found salvation. Arthur Miller wasn't just a man, he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, an intellectual giant, the author of Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. When Marilyn married him, she wasn't just becoming Mrs. Miller, she was proving something to everyone who had dismissed her as just another dumb blonde. She was marrying respectability, she was marrying depth. She was marrying the man who would finally see past the platinum hair and the curves and recognize the serious actress underneath. And for a while, it seemed to work. Arthur introduced her to literature, to poetry, to political discussions that went beyond Hollywood gossip. He defended her against the studio system. He wrote roles specifically for her. But here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize the Miller-Monroe marriage. Arthur Miller was also watching, observing, taking notes, because writers don't just live their lives, they mine them, and every vulnerability Marilyn showed him, every insecurity she confessed, every pill she needed to get through another day of filming would eventually appear somewhere in his work. By 1960, their collaboration reached its peak and its breaking point simultaneously. The Misfits, a film Arthur wrote specifically for Marilyn, a role that would finally prove she could carry a serious drama. Clark Gable would be her co-star, John Huston would direct. It was supposed to be their masterpiece. Instead, it became their funeral. The Nevada desert in summer 1960 was hell. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees. The script kept changing. Marilyn's insomnia, which had always been bad, became catastrophic. She was taking pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to get through scenes. And Arthur watched it all. The woman he had married was disintegrating in front of the cameras, and he kept writing, revising, making the character more and more obviously based on Marilyn's real struggles. Clark Gable privately expressed concern about Marilyn's health. Montgomery Clift, himself struggling with addiction, recognized a fellow sufferer. And Arthur Miller? He was there, but he wasn't present. The emotional distance between husband and wife became so obvious that crew members stopped trying to pretend they didn't notice. By the time filming wrapped in late summer, everyone knew this marriage was over. November 11, 1960. The announcement came through publicists, the way these things always did in Hollywood. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller were separating. The statement was brief, carefully worded, designed to give nothing away. But anyone who had been on that Misfits set knew the truth. This wasn't a temporary separation, this was the end, and Marilyn was about to do something that would create a legend of its own. Here's something most people don't know about American divorce in the 1950s and 60s. Getting legally unmarried wasn't as simple as deciding the marriage was over. In California, where Marilyn lived, divorce could be a lengthy, public, expensive process. Testimony had to be given, grounds had to be established, and for celebrities, the entire proceeding became a media circus. Photographers camped outside courthouses, reporters bribed clerks for documents. Every detail of your failed marriage ended up in tomorrow's headlines. Unless you knew about the alternative, unless you knew about Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. In 1932, the state of Chihuahua had passed a divorce law that was remarkably progressive for its time. The law made divorce fast, simple, and legal. No lengthy separation required, no dramatic testimony about who did what to whom. Just paperwork, signatures, and a judge's stamp. Why would Chihuahua create such accommodating divorce laws? The answer was economic. The state needed revenue. American celebrities needed privacy. By the time Marilyn's lawyers started planning her divorce, Juarez had processed thousands of American divorces. Everyone in Hollywood knew someone who had gone to Juarez. It was spoken in knowing whispers at parties, a coded phrase that meant you wanted it done quickly and quietly. But Marilyn's team had another concern beyond speed and privacy: timing, because in January 1961, there was exactly one day when they believed Marilyn Monroe could cross into Mexico, stand before a judge, and sign divorce papers without every newspaper in America covering it. January 20th, Inauguration Day. The day John F. Kennedy would become the youngest elected president in American history. Think about the logic for a moment. January 20th, 1961 would be one of the biggest news days of the year. Every television network would broadcast the ceremony live. Every newspaper would dedicate their front pages to Kennedy's oath and speech. Every photographer and reporter who mattered would be in Washington, D.C. Who would notice one movie star taking a quick trip to El Paso, Texas? Who would care about a routine border crossing when Kennedy was promising a new frontier? It was perfect misdirection. At least, that's what they believed. What they didn't understand was that Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy's lives were already becoming entangled in ways that would define both their legacies. Before the year ended, they would meet. Before 2 years passed, both would be dead under circumstances that would spawn decades of conspiracy theories. But on the morning of January 20th, 1961, they were simply two people at crossroads: Kennedy ascending to power, Marilyn escaping from her past. The woman who boarded the plane to El Paso on January 20th looked nothing like the Marilyn Monroe the world knew. Dark sunglasses obscured eyes that hadn't truly rested in weeks. A conservative coat hid the famous curves. Her blonde hair was covered. She traveled with minimal luggage and even less fanfare. A small legal team accompanied her. Everything had been arranged in advance. From El Paso, it was a short drive to the border. The crossing at Ciudad Juárez was busy that January day, but not with celebrities. Mostly it was regular commerce, trucks carrying goods, workers crossing for employment, American tourists seeking cheaper prices. Marilyn's car was waved through without incident, and suddenly Hollywood's most photographed woman was in Mexico, away from American cameras, away from American courts, away from everything except the paperwork that would legally end her marriage to Arthur Miller. The Juzgado Primero de lo Civil, the first civil court of Ciudad Juárez, had seen this scene dozens of times before. American celebrities, their faces carefully composed, entering through side doors. Lawyers with briefcases full of perfectly prepared documents. What happened inside that courthouse on January 20th was remarkably brief. Marilyn was asked to confirm her identity, to verify that she understood the documents she was signing, to state that this was her voluntary choice. The judge, who had presided over countless similar proceedings, treated it with professional efficiency. No drama, no lengthy questioning, just the legal mechanics of dissolving a marriage. Marilyn signed where she was told to sign, answered when she was asked to answer, and within less than an hour, the active part of her involvement was complete. The paperwork would take a few more days to process through the system, but the essential act, that was done. And while America watched Kennedy promise to pay any price, bear any burden, Marilyn Monroe was paying a different kind of price in a courthouse that specialized in endings. Here's where Marilyn's lawyers got it wrong. They thought choosing Inauguration Day meant choosing invisibility. They thought Kennedy's oath would overshadow everything else. They were wrong on all counts. Because even though the American press was fixated on Washington that day, the story didn't stay hidden. Local reporters in Juarez knew exactly what Marilyn Monroe's presence meant. Word spread through the border town quickly. By evening, people who claimed to have seen her were sharing stories. By the next day, Mexican newspapers were running the story. And within a week, American outlets had picked it up too. But here's the fascinating part. Because the story broke after Inauguration Day, because it was filtered through Mexican sources first, the narrative took on a different quality. It wasn't reported as breaking news. It was reported as intrigue, as mystery. The headlines didn't scream. They whispered, Marilyn's secret border divorce. Hollywood star's quiet Mexican journey. Monroe chooses Kennedy Day for personal milestone. And that whispering, that sense of hidden knowledge, made the story even more compelling than a straightforward announcement would have been. January 24th, 1961. 4 days after Marilyn stood in that Juarez courthouse, the divorce was finalized. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller were no longer married. The legal document was processed, recorded, filed. The marriage that had promised intellectual salvation was officially over, and Marilyn was legally free. But freedom, as she was about to discover, was more complicated than paperwork. The Misfits premiered just days after the divorce was finalized. Imagine having to attend premieres and give interviews about a film that documented your marriage's collapse, a film where your real-life husband wrote dialogue based on your real struggles. Marilyn attended some of the premieres. She smiled for cameras. She gave gracious interviews, and privately, according to people close to her during this period, she was barely holding together. The pills that had sustained her through the Nevada desert filming were still necessary. The insomnia was worse than ever. And now she was alone. Legally, officially, publicly alone. Arthur Miller had been her third marriage, her third attempt to find stability through partnership. And if that marriage failed, if even the intellectual partnership couldn't save her, what hope was left? Remember how we started this story? With two American icons on the same day, making very different choices, that parallel wasn't just about timing, it was prophecy. Because within months of that Inauguration Day, Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy would meet. The exact nature of their relationship remains debated. But what's undeniable is this. The president whose oath-taking provided cover for Marilyn's divorce would soon become entangled in her life in ways that would fuel conspiracy theories for generations. And when both died young, their names would be linked forever. Two people at the peak of American celebrity, two people struggling with private demons behind public perfection. 1961 was supposed to be a fresh start for Marilyn. Instead, it became a year of increasing crisis. In February, just weeks after the Juarez divorce, Marilyn checked into a psychiatric hospital in New York. The stay was brief but significant. Friends intervened. Joe DiMaggio, her second ex-husband who never stopped loving her, helped secure her release. By spring, she was attempting to work again, but the studios that had once fought over her were now hesitant. The reputation for difficulty that had begun during the Misfits filming was spreading. Insurance companies were wary, directors were concerned, and Marilyn found opportunities shrinking. The famous became infamous. The desired became difficult. The Juarez divorce wasn't just an ending, it was a marker, a point in Marilyn's timeline when you can look back and see the trajectory shifting. Before Juarez, there was still hope that marriage could provide stability. After Juarez, that hope was gone, and what rushed in to fill that void was everything that would ultimately destroy her. More pills, more isolation, more dangerous relationships, more desperate attempts to prove she was still valuable, still wanted, still the Marilyn Monroe the world expected her to be. From the day Marilyn signed those divorce papers in Juarez to the day she died was exactly 18 months. January 24th, 1961 to August 5th, 1962. In those 18 months, she would sing Happy Birthday to Kennedy in that voice, wearing that dress, in that way that would be replayed forever. She would begin and fail to complete another film. She would move into her first home that she actually owned. She would give interviews where she spoke with surprising candor about loneliness and aging. She would call friends in the middle of the night, desperate for connection. She would show flashes of the humor and intelligence that had always existed behind the image, and she would die alone, In that house she'd barely had time to make a home, under circumstances that would be investigated and debated for decades. It's impossible to talk about Marilyn's death without acknowledging the theories, the questions about Kennedy involvement, the suspicious circumstances around the investigation. But here's something worth considering. Maybe the real conspiracy wasn't about how she died. Maybe it was about how she lived, about an industry that took a vulnerable young woman and transformed her into a commodity, about a culture that celebrated her sexuality while punishing her for it, about studios that profited from her image while dismissing her intelligence. That's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but it is a systematic failure, a collective responsibility that everyone involved could deny while participating in. So why does the Juarez divorce matter? Why does this 4-day story deserve retelling? Because it captures something essential about Marilyn Monroe's final years. The gap between who she was and who everyone needed her to be was widening. The gap between the privacy she craved and the publicity she generated was unbridgeable. The border crossing was literal. From the United States to Mexico, from married to divorced, from one chapter of life to another. But it was also metaphorical. Marilyn was crossing borders constantly in those final years, between sanity and breakdown, between hope and despair, between the woman she wanted to be and the image everyone demanded she maintain. And just like that trip to Juarez, all her border crossings were supposed to be invisible, quick, discreet. But with Marilyn Monroe, nothing was ever invisible. Every private struggle became public spectacle. Every attempt at discretion became gossip. Here's the ultimate irony of choosing Kennedy's inauguration day for the divorce. Marilyn's team thought they were being clever, thought they were using one massive news story to hide another. But what they actually did was link Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy in the historical record at the exact moment when both were transitioning into the roles that would define their legacies and lead to their early deaths. Kennedy was becoming president, Marilyn was becoming legally single, and within 2 years both would be gone. Both would become subjects of endless speculation, both would be frozen in time at the peak of beauty and power and possibility. The 1960s would destroy a lot of things, a lot of people. But on January 20th, 1961, all that destruction was still ahead. Kennedy could still believe his presidency would fulfill its promise, and Marilyn could still hope that freedom from Arthur Miller meant freedom to finally become whoever she was meant to be. When we retell stories like the Juarez divorce, we're not just recounting historical facts, we're asking deeper questions. We're asking what it means when someone's private pain becomes public entertainment. We're asking what responsibility the audience bears for the celebrities they elevate and destroy. We're asking whether the machinery of fame has changed since 1961, or if we've just gotten better at disguising the same exploitation with different technologies. Marilyn Monroe crossed the border into Mexico on January 20th, 1961, seeking a legal solution to an emotional problem. She got the divorce. She didn't get the solution. And 18 months later she was dead, and we're still talking about her, still analyzing her, still trying to understand what went wrong, still using her story as a mirror for our own cultural anxieties about beauty and fame and the price women pay for both. January 20th, 1961, 2 people at crossroads, Kennedy ascending, Marilyn escaping. One would die in Dallas in 1963, the other would die in Los Angeles in 1962, and both would become immortal in ways they never anticipated. But on that January day, before all the tragedy, there was just a moment. A woman signing papers in a border courthouse, a president taking an oath on a winter day in Washington, 2 lives intersecting without touching, 2 paths crossing without meeting, 2 American stories beginning their final chapters, and none of us watching had any idea how both stories would end.